In 2023, the hottest job title in the technology industry didn't require a computer science degree, didn't require years of experience, and in some listings, didn't even require knowing how to write a single line of code. It was called prompt engineer, and it was built around one simple premise. The early large language models were unpredictable black boxes, and whoever could talk to them properly held a rare and valuable skill. Median salaries at top companies reportedly reached $296,000 at Meta and $279,000 at Google, according to compensation data tracked by industry researchers. Career coaches built entire courses around it. Reporters wrote breathless profiles of people who'd landed six-figure salaries, essentially for phrasing questions well. By early 2026, that exact job title had effectively disappeared from hiring listings at any company running a frontier artificial intelligence model. That collapse wasn't hidden or gradual in a way nobody could have seen coming. A Microsoft commissioned survey of 31,000 workers across 31 countries, conducted while the hype was still near its peak, ranked prompt engineer second to last among new roles companies actually plan to add. Job board trackers later confirmed it in the data. Some market snapshots showed listings specifically titled prompt engineer declining by roughly 30% between late 2024 and early 2026. Other trackers put the drop closer to 60% over a similar window. Whichever number you use, the direction is the same, and it moved fast for a job that had been called the future of work barely 2 years earlier. So, how does the single most talked about new career path in technology go from a no coding degree required, $200,000 dream job to functionally extinct as a standalone listing in about 3 years? The easy explanation is that the underlying models simply got better. Early versions of these systems really were brittle. They responded poorly to vague or ambiguous questions, and getting reliable, structured output required carefully handcrafted phrasing, worked examples, and step-by-step instructions written by a person who understood the model's quirks. As newer models improved at interpreting plain, ordinary language, that specialized skill mattered less, and that part of the story is genuinely true. But it doesn't fully explain the size or the speed of the collapse, because the deeper problem was that the hiring demand behind this job was never nearly as large as the media coverage made it look, even at the very peak of the hype cycle. A 2023 survey by the consulting firm McKinsey found that only 7% of organizations that had actually adopted artificial intelligence tools had hired a dedicated prompt engineer at all. The headline salaries and the breathless coverage were describing a tiny number of positions at a small number of high-profile companies, and that coverage got treated briefly as a signal about the entire labor market. Look at how the hype actually built in the first place. Late 2022, when a widely used chatbot first put large language models in front of the general public, created a media environment that was hungry for a clean, simple story about the new economy artificial intelligence was about to create. A handful of real, outlier compensation numbers, genuine six-figure offers at a small number of companies desperate to hire anyone who understood how to work around these new systems' limitations, got amplified into a much broader narrative. That narrative said this was a career anyone could enter, no technical background required, and it would stay valuable indefinitely. Boot camps and certificate programs sprang up around that promise within months. Career changers, particularly people without traditional technical backgrounds, were funneled directly into training for a job title rather than a durable skill set at almost exactly the moment the underlying technology was improving fastest and eroding the very need that job title had been built around. This is not the first time the technology industry has manufactured a standalone job title around a piece of technology before actually knowing how much durable demand for it would exist. A decade earlier, blockchain developer roles went through a strikingly similar arc, surging through the crypto boom years with compensation and hiring numbers that outran actual enterprise adoption, before contracting sharply once it became clear that most companies didn't need a dedicated blockchain team at all, only a narrower group of specialists embedded inside broader engineering organizations. Metaverse-focused roles followed a compressed version of the same pattern only a few years later, expanding rapidly around a handful of high-profile corporate announcements, then shrinking just as fast once user adoption failed to match the hiring projections built around it. In each case, the underlying technology wasn't necessarily a dead end. Blockchain infrastructure and virtual environment tools both continued to exist and even grow in narrower, more specialized applications. What collapsed each time was the standalone job category, built on the assumption that the technology's importance would translate directly and permanently into a large, independent headcount line rather than into a skill absorbed inside other, more durable roles. Prompt engineer wasn't a new kind of hype cycle. It was the same pattern the industry has now run at least 3 times in about a decade, compressed into an even shorter window because the underlying technology itself was also improving unusually fast. There's also a sharp irony sitting inside the broader automation data from this same period that's worth pulling out on its own. Widely cited workforce research, including a skill change index published by the consulting firm McKinsey, had flagged categories like structured database querying and general software development as having some of the highest exposure to automation in the entire workforce, above 30% by some measures. If that prediction had played out cleanly, engineering jobs should have been among the first casualties of better artificial intelligence tools, not prompt engineer, a job that was invented specifically because of those tools. Instead, the opposite happened. Engineering roles turned out to be some of the most resilient positions in the entire technology sector, while the job explicitly built around interfacing with the new technology was one of the first standalone categories to disappear. That reversal is the clearest evidence that the hype was misjudging not just how good the models would get, but which kinds of human work actually sat closest to the parts of the job that were easiest to automate away. The mechanism that made this specific hype cycle collapse so completely, rather than just cool off gradually, comes down to a mismatch between what companies actually needed and what the market kept selling. Companies never needed a large, permanent headcount category of people whose entire job was phrasing questions cleverly. They needed the underlying skill, understanding how to structure inputs and evaluate outputs for these systems, embedded inside people who already had some other primary expertise, whether that was software engineering, product management, security, or a specific business domain. As the standalone title faded, the skill didn't actually vanish. LinkedIn data on job postings tagging prompt engineering specifically as a skill rather than as a job title grew by roughly 250% over the same period that postings with prompt engineer in the title were declining. The work moved inside broader roles like artificial intelligence engineer, artificial intelligence product manager, and newer titles focused on evaluating model quality and failure modes. Compensation for people doing that work inside those broader roles has generally kept rising, not falling, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect if the underlying skill itself had become worthless. 3 pressures compounded on top of each other to make the standalone job collapse as fast as it did. First, model improvement removed the core technical justification for a dedicated human translator sitting between a person and the system, since plain language input increasingly worked well enough on its own. Second, the role was structurally never going to scale into a large, durable headcount category in the first place, since real adoption was thin even during the peak of the hiring boom, meaning the supply of people training for this specific title was always going to outpace the actual number of standalone positions available. Third, the training and career coaching ecosystem that built up around the title kept pushing new entrants toward it for roughly a year after the actual warning signs, including that Microsoft commissioned survey ranking it near the bottom of companies' hiring plans, were already publicly available to anyone paying attention to the data instead of the headlines. The people who bet most heavily on this specific title, rather than on the underlying skill, are the ones left holding the weakest position now. Career changers who left other fields specifically to retrain around prompt engineer as a primary identity, often through a boot camp or certificate program built around exactly that title, are now competing for jobs where the posting doesn't use that language anymore at all. Their actual technical knowledge, how to structure inputs, evaluate model outputs, and understand failure modes is still genuinely valuable and still in demand. But it now has to be repackaged and sold as a supporting skill inside a broader role like artificial intelligence engineer or product manager, rather than presented as a standalone qualification, which is a much harder pitch to make convincingly on a resume built entirely around the title that just disappeared from hiring manager searches. The boot camps and certificate programs that sold the narrower path largely moved on to marketing whatever the next in-demand title happens to be, leaving the people who followed their original advice to do the repositioning work themselves. It's worth being precise about what actually happened here, because the honest version of this story isn't that prompt engineering turned out to be worthless. The skill is more widely used today inside more job titles than it was at the height of the hype. What collapsed specifically was the idea that phrasing questions well could function as someone's entire standalone professional identity indefinitely, without any other underlying technical or domain expertise attached to it. That distinction matters because it's the difference between a skill that got absorbed into the broader economy, which is what actually happened, and a skill that turned out to be fake, which is the version that gets repeated in hindsight but isn't quite accurate. There's also a broader signal sitting underneath this specific story that's easy to miss if you only look at the one collapsed job title. New hiring data reported in the middle of 2026 found that while overall technology headcount at major firms had fallen 25% compared to 2019 levels, core engineering roles had declined only 11% over the same stretch, and engineers actually made up 55% of all new hires at large technology companies in 2025, up sharply from before. The layer actually being eliminated at scale wasn't hands-on technical work at all. It was middle management, the roles that used to translate business intent into engineering plans, which was being cut at roughly 41% according to the same data. Prompt engineer turns out to have been a preview of that same pattern in miniature, a role built around translating between people and a system that got hollowed out once the system got good enough to be understood more directly, while the people doing durable, harder to replace, technical, and judgment-based work kept getting hired at nearly the same rate as before. The next hot standalone artificial intelligence job title is probably already circulating somewhere in hiring listings and career advice content right now, promising the same thing this one did: a shortcut into a lucrative technical career without the years normally required to build the underlying expertise. It will likely come with its own round of outlier salary headlines drawn from a small number of companies, its own wave of boot camps and certificate programs built around the label rather than the skill, and its own eventual reckoning with how much of the coverage was ever actually describing broad employer demand rather than a handful of unusually well-compensated early hires. Whether that next title follows the same arc, a fast climb built more on media coverage than on actual breadth of hiring demand, followed by an equally fast collapse into a bullet point inside someone else's job description, is the only part of this story that hasn't already played out. Based on the last 3 cycles, the safer bet is that it will.